Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about the Bomber B, or B Bomber project. As the name would suggest, the Bomber B project was the second project of its rather bland name, and it would be a competition for a new, in effect, schnellbomber, or fast bomber for the German Luftwaffe. The preceding competition, Bomber A, was for a large strategic heavy bomber, a type of bomber that is not typically associated with the Luftwaffe. The winner of this competition was the Heinkel HE-177, a twin-engine heavy bomber that had a rather alarming issue of catching on fire a lot, which is not ideal for anything other than a kamikaze plane. In the midst of the Bomber A project around mid-1939, some interesting and enticing pieces of technology began making their ways to German testing facilities. Some engines that would offer significant boosts in power without needing the added weight and drag of extra engine nacelles. These new engines, namely in the Junkers Jumo 222, and Daimler-Benz DB604 were 24-cylinder inline liquid-cooled engines. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, several major powers had been looking into and attempting to develop these larger inline liquid-cooled engines, and they very often appeared in the form of the so-called X-24 design. Like how a pretty standard 12-cylinder inline engine is a V-shape with 6 cylinders on either side forming a V, the X design effectively combined two 12-cylinder V engines into a singular engine with a single crankshaft. This would be the general design shape used by the DB604, and for the Jumo 222, it would go even further with a more uncommon hexagonal shape, where instead of having 4 rows of 6 cylinders, it had 6 rows of 4 cylinders, thus making it hexagonal, or perhaps like a Star of David, which for a German engine is both ironic and darkly comedic. But regardless, it was with these kind of engines, and more specifically the Jumo 222, that the Bomber B project would be formed around. Conceptually, the winner or winners of the Bomber B project would go on to replace whatever Germany currently had in their arsenal of medium bombers, from the Junkers Ju-88 to the Dornier Do to the Heinkel HE-111. The prospective winner of the project would be a bomber that was faster than all of them, while also being larger overall and carrying a much greater payload. It was effectively to be a sort of super medium bomber, big, fast, and powerful. With this general idea in mind, the Reich Air Ministry would send out specifications for the Bomber B project in July 1939, and it would call for a bomber that could carry a 8,800-pound payload, a range of about 2,200 miles, at a top speed of 373 miles an hour. Additionally, it was to have both a pressurized cockpit and dive brakes, basically some high-altitude and low-altitude combat equipment, along with remote defensive turrets. To these specifications, 4 prospective designs would emerge. Technically, there were at least 5, perhaps 6, but one would join the project a little later on, and the other, a supposed Heinkel design, in the P-1045, has such little information on it that I'm not 100% sure it even existed. But the 4 initial designs were the Junkers Ju-288, Arado E.340, the Dornier Do-317, and our subject for today, the Focke-Wulf Fw-191. Now, before we get to our main subject for today, I do want to briefly talk about the other 3, to see what the Fw-191 would be going up against. The least successful but most visually interesting of the four would be the Arado E.340. Their design featured a split tail, where each half of the tail extended out from each engine nacelle. At the rear of each tailpiece, and at the rear of the central fuselage pod, was a remote-controlled turret. While it was certainly an interesting design, it appears as though it went no further than the drawing board, and it was very quickly removed from the race. Then there was the Dornier Do 317, arguably the third most successful of the four designs, and it would have a grand total of 6 aircraft made. Built as a successor to the Do 217, itself a successor to the Do 17, the 317 differed from its predecessors mainly in having a fully glass nose, a pressurized cockpit, and much stronger engines. However, the 317 project was very quickly put on the back burner, and Dornier would be ordered to focus more on the Do 217. But later on, just in case the FW-191 and Ju-288 projects failed, the 317 was given a little bit more attention, and was intended to be constructed with either DB603 or DB610 engines. The 610 engines were sort of parallel to the X-24 engines, in that they had 24 cylinders, but in reality it was literally just 2 DB605 engines connected to run as a single unit, a lot more rudimentary. Either way, when it was finally tested, the Do 317 wasn't much better than the Do 217, and as a result, that project was cancelled. For the main opposition to our subject for today, we have the Junkers Ju-288, the plane that was likely at the very center of the Bomber B project, and was probably the reason for its existence in the first place. A few months prior to the specs of the B-Bomber project being released, Junkers either submitted, or at the very least was in the later design stages of, a potential successor to the Ju-88 in their EF-73 or EF-74 design. This design had been in the works as early as 1937, and featured an extended cockpit canopy that, at least to me, looks kind of insect-like, along with a pressurized cockpit and 2 rear defensive turrets, one above, one below. Intended to be powered by 2 Jumo 222s, Junkers would estimate that the top speed was a blistering 416 miles an hour. Now, we'll come back to the Ju-288 later, and for our focus for today, we have Focke-Wulf's contribution in the FW-191. Visually speaking, the 191 was not terribly interesting or unique looking, with a fully glass nose like the Do 317, a overall slim fuselage, and a twin-fin tail. Measuring in at 19.63 meters long, 26 meters wide, and 5.6 meters tall, the 191 was overall larger than the Do 317 and Ju-288, but not by all that much. The 191 would feature a relatively decent defensive armament, with there being 5 different turrets scattered about the plane. One turret with 2 7.92mm machine guns would be found under the nose. 2 turrets with a single 7.92mm gun would be at the rear of each engine nacelle. A turret with a 20mm cannon and 2 7.92mm guns would be in the dorsal position, and a similar turret would be found in the ventral position. Overall, for a German bomber, it certainly wasn't a bad defensive armament. For its offensive capabilities, at max, the 191 could carry both internally and externally up to 9,240 pounds of explosives. With a gross weight of around 52,000 pounds, the 191 was a good few thousand pounds heavier than the other two aircraft. This was at least partially due to its greater dimensions and slightly greater armament, but it was also contributed to by a rather interesting design feature, a feature that was explicitly requested by the Reich Air Ministry that Focke-Wulf did not want to do. Internally, the 191 was to have all or almost all electrically powered systems, instead of hydraulically powered or mechanically powered. While I don't know the specific reason for this request being made just for the 191 and not on the other Bomber B competitors, I do strongly suspect that it was because of Focke-Wulf's own FW-190 design, and the fact that it featured these electric systems. So I suspect that the Air Ministry wanted to see if that could be done on a much greater scale. However, as Germany would later learn, there are several reasons why fully electric systems on an aircraft can be detrimental, and likely even more so with where technology was at back in the World War II era. The most immediate problem was weight. With all of the necessary electric motors being added to various points on the plane, along with all of the necessary additional wiring, that was a lot of extra weight that Focke-Wulf didn't want in their design. But probably the more serious issue was the durability of such a system. As the technology was certainly more rudimentary than it would be today, it would be a lot more finicky and susceptible to damage. Focke-Wulf, in their complaints to the Reich Air Ministry about why they did not want to include this system, believed that just a single well-placed shot would be enough to take out the entire system, completely disabling all of the plane's operational systems. Regardless, though, their complaints would fall on deaf ears, and the 191 prototypes were ordered to be completed with these electric systems regardless. And because of these systems, the 191 received the unofficial nickname of the Flying Powerstation, which admittedly is a pretty fun nickname. Construction of two prototype models began in late 1940, and by early 1942, the first prototype was ready to fly. This early version was a bit different than the proposed design, in that it didn't have any armament, nor did it have a pressurized cockpit, but this can be considered pretty normal as far as prototypes are concerned. But it did have a much more glaring difference, though, in its engines, and the Jumo 222 engines were nowhere to be seen. This was because, even by early 1942, they simply weren't ready. Initially, in the Jumo 222 design, it was projected that it would have around 2,000 horsepower, which was certainly solid for an engine of its era. However, it was soon requested in mid-1941 that the power output be boosted up to 2,500 horsepower, as studying of the Ju-288, and at least by proxy the FW-191 designs, led to the Air Ministry and Luftwaffe realizing that 2,000 horsepower per engine was simply not enough for what they wanted out of the 288 and 191. This request would come at a bit of a turning point for the Jumo 222 project, as some early issues with what were considered minor coolant leaks, fuel leaks, and other small failures had since spiraled into bigger issues with piston connecting rod failures, and even though the 222 had been slated in mid-1941 to begin production by late August 1942, it was starting to become clear that that start date would not be happening. This would mean that in the meantime, while the 222 was still in development, Focke-Wulf needed a different engine to use on the 191, a admittedly much weaker engine, that would at least allow them to test out the general flight characteristics of their design. To this need, Focke-Wulf elected to use the BMW 801, a 14-cylinder radial engine with around 1,500 horsepower. This was a far cry from the 222 and its 2,500 horsepower, but Focke-Wulf didn't have all that much of a choice in the matter. With this significant decrease in power, when the 191 V1 flew for the first time in early 1942, even with the weight being reduced down to around 45,000 pounds due to the missing armament, the missing pressurized cockpit, and smaller and lighter engines, it was regardless incredibly underpowered. Adding to this problem was the fact that the all-electric systems in the plane were leading to some teething issues, with at least some of the many electric motors failing mid-flight. And since the electric motors controlled things like the control surfaces, this was a major issue. When the V2 prototype would take to the air a couple months later, outfitted with the same BMW 801 engines, the exact same problems presented themselves. This then left Focke-Wulf in a rather tight spot. One of the engines that the whole Bomber B project was built around was suffering from severe delays, and the other potential Bomber B engine in the DB604 was actually faring even worse, eventually being outright cancelled in September 1942. This left not only the FW-191, but the JU-288 and DO-317 without the engines that they desperately needed. And for the 191, the Air Ministry requested all-electric systems were only adding to the project's problems. This led to Focke-Wulf then lobbying the Air Ministry, in an effort to ease the burden on the 191 project, to drop the all-electric requirement, and surprisingly the Air Ministry relented, and allowed Focke-Wulf to use hydraulic systems in addition to the electric systems. With this change would come a sharp diversion in the 191 project. When that change was accepted, Focke-Wulf was already working on the V3, V4, and V5 prototypes, with the all-electric systems, and instead of reworking those prototypes, construction on them was simply halted, never to begin again, and work on the V6 with the hydraulic systems would begin. As this prototype would be pretty different internally speaking, and it began from scratch, it took nearly a year until late 1942, early 1943, that the V6 prototype took to the air, and miraculously, it actually had two Jumo 222 engines in it, two of the roughly 300 Jumo 222s that were ever made. With the stronger engine and reworked control systems, the V6 prototype represented a solid improvement over the V1 and V2, and the top speed of the V6 reached upwards of 385 miles an hour, and the internal control system failures seemed to subside. This seemed like it would be great news for the FW-191, and the entire Bomber B project as a whole. But as I kind of just alluded to, even though the 191 got some of the Jumo 222 engines, those engines never really got past the prototype and testing phase. There were a lot of different tests and iterations, hence why there were almost 300 of the 222 engines made, but general issues surrounding durability and power output and the like were never actually resolved. In fact, the engines that the V6 were using were underpowered versions of the Jumo 222, with 2,200 horsepower instead of 2,500. So even though performance improved on the V6 design, it kind of didn't matter, because any production version of that plane would not have those engines in it. Still though, Focke-Wulf would persist, and in the face of the unavailable engines, they would propose two alternate versions of the 191. The original was to be dubbed the 191A, and that one had the Jumo 222. Then they would have the 191B, likely proposed sometime in 1942, and that one would swap in some more crude engines of comparable power in either the DB606 or 610. The engines that were effectively just two DB601s or 605s, respectively, bolted together to run as a single unit. While these engines would offer comparable and sometimes even greater power, that greater power came at the cost of increased weight and overall reduced reliability. One of the more prominent users of these coupled engines was the HE-177 mentioned at the start, and as mentioned earlier, the 177 had a rather alarming problem of catching on fire a lot. This was at least partially due to the coupled engines, and also partially due to the design of its engine nacelles, exacerbating those issues with the engines. The short of it was that there were oil leaks from the engines, and the 177's nacelles were designed in such a way that allowed oil to build up, and gave that oil some easy access to hot exhaust pipes, causing the severe fires. But even independent of the 177's overall design issues, these coupled DB606 and 610 engines were pretty prone to other failures regardless, oil issues at high altitude, overheating, etc. In essence, the coupled engines were a more crude attempt to boost performance. But even with those engine issues, Focke-Wulf would plan a series of prototypes for these new engines. V13 through V18 were all planned to have the DB610 engine. Meanwhile, prototypes V7 through V12 were just outright cancelled, as those were to have the Jumo 222. It was clear that this plan was a desperation move, as the increased weight of these engines meant that in conjunction, the overall payload would have to be reduced, and some of the defensive armament, namely the two engine nacelle turrets, would have to be removed to keep the weight more manageable. Even with that factored in, though, the prospective 191B models saw their gross weight balloon up to around 56,000 pounds. Likely because of this, and the fact that the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, had a very strong hatred of the DB606 and 610, the FW191B never really became more than a proposal. For one last attempt to save the project, Focke-Wulf would propose the 191C, that instead used four smaller, more typical engines, like the Jumo 211, or DB601, or DB605. This model would also simplify production through the removal of the pressurized cockpit and the removal of the remote-operated turrets, those being replaced with manually operated turrets. This proposal would amount to absolutely nothing, though, and not only was it basically ignored, but the entire Bomber B project would come to a disappointing end. This too meant that the Ju-288 design, the clear frontrunner in the competition, ended up failing as well. The 288 also attempted to replace the Jumo 222 engines with DB610s, but again, due to their own issues and Hermann Göring's hatred of them, the Ju-288 would never enter production, and across all of its prototypes, only about 24 or so of them were ever made. So, with the Bomber B project utterly failing, this effectively forced Germany's hand in what aircraft they would have to use for the rest of the war. They would now be forced to use the Ju-88 and to a lesser extent the Do-17 and HE-111. This, on one hand, fit in well with their earlier goals of sort of homogenizing aircraft production to a lesser number of multi-role aircraft. But at the same time, it also ensured that Germany had to, no matter what, use these older designs that use these smaller engines, which then put an effective cap on their potential growth. The failure of the Jumo 222 and DB604 sort of capped German aircraft potential for the time being. But in a way, their failure probably had an influence on their stronger focus on jet and rocket propulsion. Now, this is just some inferring on my part, but I do feel as though the failure of this next generation of piston engines meant that there would be an increased urgency to bring about jet engines, to bring about the more powerful engines that would help them win the war. And of course, Germany losing the war at the end there would also bring about that urgency. But still, the failure of those earlier engines had to have some kind of influence. But overall, for the FW-191 project, I think its failure shows that Germany's fixation on these sort of superweapons was a major detriment. For a bomber, you don't really need it to have amazing speed. You don't need it to be able to dive bomb. You really just need it to be able to hold a lot of bombs. Make a bog standard 4-engine bomber, throw some escort fighters around it, and there you go. You got a fine weapon for what you really need it to do. Germany simply needed to remember KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, I think this might be for me playing those more recently made Wolfenstein games, but when I think of an electric German bomber, I kind of imagine it having Tesla coils on the fuselage, just shooting electricity out for no reason. And on board it are like 50 soldiers in full Fallout-style power armor. If you haven't played those before, they're really fun games. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.